Picture this. The year is 80 AD. You are not in a marble Senate house debating philosophy. You are in the Colosseum. The air is thick with the metallic tang of blood, sweat, and wine. 50,000 voices are unified in a single deafening roar. On the sand, a woman is being tied to a stake. This is not sport. This is not justice. This is supplicium, a public ritual, a form of psychological vivisection designed not just to end a life, but to disassemble a human being in front of a cheering crowd. This was not the chaotic release of mob violence. It was a calculated architecture of terror. The accounts are not hidden. They are in the plain, sober writings of historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, and in the visceral, often censored poetry of Martial. These contemporary records reveal a horrifying truth. Rome didn't just punish deviance, it performed it, weaponizing sexual humiliation to control an entire population. The horror began with the parade of shame. Imagine a condemned woman, stripped completely naked, dragged by chains through the very streets she once walked as a citizen. This wasn't just a walk. It was a meticulously routed performance of degradation. Guards would force her past her own home, past the temples where she used to pray, past the market where she shopped. The psychological why is chilling. To methodically erase her identity, to sever every tie she had to her own life, all before she was even dead. The historian Tacitus confirms this was state policy. When the Iceni queen Boudica defied them, Roman soldiers didn't just seize her lands, they publicly flogged her and brutally raped her 2 daughters. A calculated message that no woman, not even royalty, was safe from this ultimate tool of control. This principle applied even to Roman citizens. Consider the punishment for Christian women of noble birth, as recorded by chroniclers like Eusebius. Around 304 AD, a 13-year-old girl named Agnes refused to marry a Roman official, citing her religious vow of virginity. Her punishment was a perfect example of this psychological warfare. She was not immediately killed. First, she was stripped naked and dragged through the streets to a lupanar, a public brothel, to be violated by the mob. The state's logic was diabolical, to punish her for her devotion to purity by ritually and publicly destroying it. Her identity as a virgin was the target, and her humiliation was the weapon. The second layer was the theatre of depravity. Once inside the arena, the 50,000 spectators became the directors of a macabre pornographic play. Ancient accounts are explicit. Women were forced to reenact twisted mythological rape scenes. The poet Martial, in his On the Spectacles, provides a chilling eyewitness account. He describes a woman forced to play the part of Pasiphae, the mythical queen who lusted after a bull. He writes, almost casually, how a real bull was brought into the arena to publicly mate with and disembowel her, a horrifying fusion of sexual violence and execution. This was not a rare event. It was a celebrated feature, advertised in advance. But for those who defied Rome's gods, the cruelty was specialized. The historian Eusebius documents the case of Blandina in 177 CE. After enduring a marathon of torture, she was taken to the arena, hung on a stake as bait for wild animals. When they wouldn't touch her, she was roasted on a red-hot iron grate, before finally being gored to death by a bull. The crowd watched the entire days-long ordeal as entertainment. Perhaps the most haunting account comes from the Passion of Saints Perpetua and Felicitas, a text from 203 AD, part of which is believed to be Perpetua's own diary. Perpetua, a 22-year-old noblewoman, and her slave Felicitas, who had just given birth in prison, were condemned together. The text describes how they were stripped naked and placed in nets, a detail intended to expose their bodies to the crowd, and brought into the arena to face a savage heifer, an animal specifically chosen, as the text notes, to mock their sex. The cow repeatedly gored and tossed the women. The diary describes a surreal human moment. Perpetua, dazed, sees Felicitas knocked down and, in an act of pure instinct, walks over to help her up. She then notices her own tunic is torn, and she pulls it down to cover her thigh. Being more mindful of her modesty, than of her pain. This small act of dignity, in the face of such unimaginable sexualized violence, is the ultimate testament to the system's cruelty. The third layer was the psychological vivisection. If the victim was still alive after the animals, the crowd demanded the final act. This was the grand finale of the executioner's art. The historian Suetonius hints at this, describing how emperors would demand that victims feel themselves dying. The crowd would roar for the lanistae, the animal handlers turned torturers, or the carnifex, the state executioner, a man so socially polluted by his job that he was forbidden from living inside the city walls. They would use short, sharp knives. The goal, celebrated by the cheering crowd, was to prolong the agony. They would start with non-lethal cuts, slicing open limbs, peeling back skin, all while the victim was kept fully conscious, often held down or tied to a stake. This is the moment that gives our title its name, being cut open, piece by piece. The poet Martial wrote of spectacles where the victims' insides were exposed while they still breathed, a horrifying, drawn-out process that could last for agonizing minutes. This was the ultimate assertion of Roman power, not just to kill, but to deconstruct a human being, piece by piece, before a live audience. But some punishments were kept hidden, reserved for crimes so dark, they required a ritual of pure, symbolic horror. This was the cullis, or the sack. This punishment was reserved for women and men who committed parricide, the murder of a parent. This was considered a crime that unraveled the fabric of the state, and so its punishment was a ritual of pure symbolic negation. The condemned woman was stripped and beaten with virgi sanguinii, blood-coloured rods. Then she was sewn alive into a heavy leather sack, but she was not alone. Inside the sack they placed 4 animals, each a symbol of a corrupted virtue: a dog, violating piety; a rooster, violating family respect; a viper, violating parental love; and a monkey, a grotesque parody of a human. The sack was sealed and thrown into the sea or a river. Her death was a lightless, panicked frenzy of claws, fangs, and beaks, a ritual designed to exile the criminal from all elements of the natural world: earth, air, fire, and water. Another secret method was not public at all, but designed for the emperor's private pleasure. This was the tunica molesta, or the shirt of affliction. Tacitus describes how Emperor Nero used this to punish Christians, whom he blamed for the Great Fire of Rome. Women, among others, were coated in pitch, wax, and sulfur, or forced into tunics soaked in these materials. They were then fixed to stakes in Nero's private gardens and set on fire. They became human torches, illuminating the darkness for his private parties. This was a different kind of cruelty, not a public warning, but the intimate, sadistic entertainment of an absolute tyrant. But the true, dark genius of Roman cruelty was reserved for its most sacred women, the Vestal Virgins. These priestesses were untouchable. Their one job, to protect the eternal flame that guaranteed the empire's survival. They were more powerful than senators. But if a Vestal broke her sacred vow of chastity, a crime called incestum because it polluted the state, Rome faced a dilemma. They could not spill her blood without angering the gods. So they devised a punishment of thematic inevitability, a living nightmare. The historian Pliny the Younger documented it. First, the accused Vestal was stripped naked before the entire Roman Senate. A slow ceremonial degradation. Then she was beaten with rods. And then she was taken on a funeral litter, though she was still alive, to a small, dark underground chamber, and buried alive. They left her with a single lamp, a piece of bread, and a flask of water, not to survive, but to suffer longer. Pliny gives us the specific, horrifying case of Cornelia, the chief Vestal, condemned by Emperor Domitian around 91 AD. Pliny, who believed her to be innocent, describes her execution. As she was being led to the chamber, her robes caught on something. She stumbled. When the executioner reached out to help her, she recoiled in horror. a visceral, final defense of the very purity for which she was about to die. And here, in this pitch-black tomb, is the ironic human moment. The chamber walls were lined with broken pottery. If she clawed at the walls in the dark, her final defiant act of survival was designed to be its own form of self-mutilation. Pliny notes one Vestal survived for 18 days. 18 days in a dark underground tomb, starving, dehydrating, and going insane. This architecture of terror was not the work of a rogue mob. It was imperial policy. Emperor Caligula would spend weeks planning a woman's degradation. Emperor Nero would dress as a wild beast and personally participate in the sexual assault of condemned women in the arena. This was not just sadistic, it was bureaucratic. This was so normalized, Rome had a salaried government job for designing torture, the magistrate of public degradation. This was part of the panem et circenses, bread and circuses policy. But the circuses weren't just a distraction. They were mass psychological conditioning. They were a state-funded, regularly scheduled inoculation of terror, designed to teach the populace that the state had the power not only to take your life, but to take your dignity, your identity, and your very humanity. When these horrific practices finally ended, it wasn't because of a noble emperor's decree. It was because, over 3 centuries, Christian influence slowly changed the public's appetite. The crowds simply lost their taste for it. But the normalization was so complete that archaeologists find this brutality everywhere. When they excavate private Roman villas, they find these exact scenes of execution in their living room mosaics. It was home decor. This is the true, enduring warning of Rome. The civilized mind is terrifyingly good at normalizing the barbaric. The Romans built aqueducts in ECTs and wrote poetry while cheering for live dismemberment. The impulse for public shaming has not vanished. It has merely been digitized. The Romans had the Colosseum. We have the screen. The digital Colosseum of public shaming, the algorithmic promotion of ruin, the commodification of cruelty. The tools are different, but the psychology is identical. The only question is, what forms of psychological torture have we normalized as entertainment? And what will future historians write about us?